We're picking up with Moses again. When we last saw Moses, God had set him on a mission. He was headed off to go save the Israelites, to go confront Pharaoh. And he was going rather begrudgingly. He didn't want to really go. He said, God, send somebody else. And God finally said, well, here's Aaron. Your older brother Aaron's going to go with you. He'll be your mouthpiece, and I will tell both of you what to say, and you will talk to Pharaoh and deliver the message. So they go back and they go and confront Pharaoh, and they first go to the leaders of Israel, and they go and tell them that God has heard your cries, God has heard your oppression, and now he's come to deliver you. And they bow down and they worship God and like, thank you, God, that you finally heard us. And so then Aaron and Moses go and confront Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says, you think I'm going to let him go? I don't think so. And he says, by the way, if you guys have all this time to talk about leaving somewhere, well, here's what I'm going to do. All of you that are making bricks, you need to go find your own straw now to go make bricks. And so he makes their work harder. Well, Aaron and Moses go back to everybody and say, hey, we talked with Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said, well, he's not going to let us go, but God will he's going to work things out. And all they said was, well, why'd you come here and bother us and mess up everything in the first place? Because now Pharaoh is telling us that we have to go find our own straw in order to make bricks, and the quota hasn't gone down. And you came to deliver us, but you actually made our work even harder. But God wasn't finished yet. Got a question for you as we go into this story, and that is, how far do you think God is willing to go to deliver you? How far do you think God is willing to go to deliver you? Well, today, as we look at God's deliverance of Israel from Pharaoh's oppression and slavery, we're going to look at a couple of different things. One, God called and equipped Moses and Aaron. We already talked about that. But two, God performs signs and wonders. And as he goes to do this, we talked about some of those signs and wonders last week, about the snake the staff that's going to turn into a snake and those kinds of things. Well, they go and they step into Pharaoh's court and they go and perform these signs and wonders. And there's the beginning ones are ones that the magicians of Pharaoh's courtyard are actually able to copy. Now we stop and think, wow, God provided this miracle and God provided this sign. How could someone who's practicing something that's a dark magic art match it? Well, they managed to do this. Somehow they were able to do it. So here are the ones that we see. First of all, they come in and they talk to Pharaoh, and Aaron throws the staff down, and it turns into a snake. Well, you'd think everybody, oh wow, look at that, it turned into a snake. Well, no, the magicians that were there too, they throw their staffs down and they turn into snakes too. So we have all these snakes slithering all over Pharaoh's court. Then Aaron decides to swallow up the other ones. And that's over. Well, okay, the magicians are thinking, see, we can do what you do. Well, Moses is like, well, what am I supposed to do about that? I threw it down like you said, and they threw down, and we had a big old match, and my snake ate their snakes, and I picked it back up, turned it into a staff, but we're not anywhere further along than what we were supposed to be. And God says to them, well, Moses and Aaron, go out to the Nile, raise that staff over the Nile, and it'll turn into blood. So they go out, and they raise the staff over the Nile turns into blood. Not just the Nile turning into blood, but all the pots that had water in them that were sitting around in places turned into blood. Well, the magicians are like, hey, that's no biggie. We can match that. We can do that too. And so they do their incantations and their things, and more blood, more water turned into blood. There was no clean drinking water in any of Egypt. So much so that the Bible story says that the Egyptians started digging wells along the edge of the Nile, digging holes in the ground to get clean water to come in there because all the other water was turned into blood. So then Moses and Aaron are like, okay, what's going on with this? The magicians match this again. I think somewhere in here the Egyptians are starting to go, hello, you magicians, would you stop one-upping everything or matching everything? It was bad enough that there was as much blood and water turned into blood that you had to even make it more? Come on. Well, now the next plague comes. Frogs. 7 days went by after the Nile had turned to blood, right? And now frogs. Frogs everywhere. Frogs in the houses, frogs in the bedrooms, frogs all over the place. There's nowhere you could go where there weren't frogs. You were stepping on frogs. You were dancing around frogs. Frogs were dancing on you. There was no way you could get away from the frogs. And the magicians are like, this isn't something God can do. We can do this too. And so they do an incantation, and there's more frogs. And frogs are piled on top of frogs all over the place. And again, I'm thinking the Egyptian people are going, would you magicians please stop? We had enough frogs already. Why did you have to match it and add to the frogs? Biblical humor, you've got to catch this. I mean, come on. It's like they keep adding on to what's going on. They're like, oh, here's a plague. We can make a plague happen too. Twice the plague, twice the fun. I mean, come on. So Pharaoh is so tired of the frogs, he gets Moses to come in and Aaron to come in. He says to them, would you please bring an end to the frogs? So Moses is like, name the time. Get this. Pharaoh says, tomorrow. Why not right now? Pharaoh's like, tomorrow. End with the frogs tomorrow. Oh, okay. So he says they'll end tomorrow. Well, the next day, just as promised, there were no frogs left alive anywhere but in the Nile River. But left alive. All the frogs that were piled on top of the frogs all died right wherever they were. So there were frog carcasses, all of dead frogs all over Egypt. There was, if they had snow shovels back then, there was snow shoveling frogs and piling them all up into big heaps all over the place. Dead frogs everywhere. Now, we start to move into another set of signs that happened that the magicians, thankfully for the Egyptian people, they couldn't match. Because here comes the first one of these. God performs a sign and wonder. They strike the dust. Moses and Aaron strike the dust, and the dust turns into gnats all over the land of Egypt. The magicians tried to do it. They hadn't learned their lesson yet. It's like, oh, you can make gnats that go all over the place? We're going to try to make gnats that go all over the place. And thankfully, all of Egypt breathed a sigh of relief because they couldn't do it. And at this point in time, because the magicians couldn't copy it, they turned to Pharaoh and go, this is the hand of God. We can't make gnats. It must be God. Follow me. Follow me. It's okay. It's not sacrilegious. There's a humor in this. There is. There really is. Anyway, so that happens. And now, the next plague that comes, the next wonder that comes from God, he tells them, here it comes. It's flies. So flies come. And flies pour in just waves and waves and waves of flies come into every open space in Egypt. The magicians aren't even trying to make the flies now. They're just letting it go. But there's flies everywhere in the land of Egypt except in the land of Goshen. Now God's upping the ante even more. He's saying, you know what? These plagues are just going to happen to the Egyptians. And I'm going to make a distinction. And the place in Goshen is where the Israelites lived. And he said, there will be no flies there. It won't happen there. And so the flies come pouring in to every place except Goshen. Well, that wasn't enough to quite turn it around, so you get warned, well, here comes another plague that's going to land on all the Egyptians and upon their animals as well, boils. So Moses takes some soot up and casts it into the air, and boils start breaking out on all the Egyptians and on all of their livestock, but there weren't any boils on anybody that lived in the land of Goshen. And believe it or not, as they noted in the story, the magicians were hit especially hard with the boils. They couldn't even come and stand before Pharaoh. They were just boiling over. It was so bad. I added that. You won't find that boiling over. I put that in there. That wasn't enough to turn their mind around. So here comes a hailstorm. The worst hailstorm, the worst Egypt had ever seen to that point. A hailstorm, lightning striking the ground. A hailstorm comes in. God even, through Moses, warns the Egyptians, bring in your livestock, bring in your slaves, get everybody out of the field because this is going to be the worst hailstorm that you've ever seen. The worst in history comes in, the hail comes, it hails everywhere, but in the land of Goshen. All the crops that were coming up for harvest at that time were destroyed. Others that were still down low on the ground that hadn't sprouted up yet were saved. But these ones, all the other ones that were up were destroyed. God didn't convert his mind, so Pharaoh's heart, so now it was locusts. So the locusts were sent, and they were driven in by the wind. And by this point in time, the Pharaoh's officials are now telling him, would you let the people go already? Just let them go already. And Pharaoh wouldn't let them go. And so the locusts came in across the land and ate everything else that was left that wasn't destroyed by the hail. And then it keeps getting harder and harder. We're coming to the end of all this. But the next plague that came was darkness. The way the Bible describes it, it was darkness that could be felt. I don't know if you've ever been someplace where you could feel dark. Feel dark. So we live in places that have a lot of street lights and stuff now, but if you ever get out somewhere away from everything and there's no moon and the clouds are, dark. There are places I used to live in Pennsylvania, whenever there weren't any lights and you're in your house and you're in your bedroom and you open your eyes and you go like this with your hand, you can't see anything. The only time you know your hand's there is when you get too close and you whack yourself in the head like that. It's that dark. All right. But even then, you can't really feel that darkness. We're going even a step further than that. And it was that dark for 3 days. It even says that they did not have light inside of their dwelling places lamps weren't working as far as getting light out. It was sucking in the light. There was that much darkness. Other than in the land of Goshen, they had light in the places where they lived. The Israelites had light in the places where they lived. Still not enough to finally let them all go. And so here comes the culmination of all these wonders that God is performing. The length that he's willing to go to deliver his chosen people, Israel. And that is that the firstborn of Egypt, we're going to die. The firstborn of all the humans and also the firstborn of all the cattle. And God comes and talks to the Israelites and all this because that plague is coming, and he brings warning to his chosen people, and he says, okay, here's what you need to do. Your deliverance is at hand. It's going to come quickly. You need to be ready for it. First of all, you need to be prepared to protect yourself from the destroyer who is coming. Second of all, you're going to need to eat a meal, but you're going to need to eat it in haste. You need to be packed, ready to go. Have your cloak tucked into your belt. Have your sandals on. Be ready to hit the door because your deliverance is coming. You don't even have time to put yeast in your bread, and you don't have time when you're going to roast a lamb, but you don't have time to prep the lamb, dress the lamb, or anything like that. You're just going to sacrifice him and roast him over the fire. And you're all supposed to eat him, and if everything doesn't get eaten by the morning, just throw the rest of them in the fire and let it burn it up. Nothing gets left over. But you need to eat this in haste and be ready to go, because your deliverance is coming. And God gives instructions to the Israelites to say, whenever you sacrifice that lamb for the meal, take the blood from the lamb and put it on your door frame. Put it on the sides and on the top. And when the destroyer comes through the night, he will see that blood and he'll pass over your house. That's where Passover comes from. He's going to pass over your house. And the destroyer will not enter your house and destroy the firstborn of your family. So listen to this and do this. And so they do it. And they're also warned, after you put the blood around this and as you're having your meal that night, do not go outside. Stay inside of your dwelling. And so that night, as they're all eating this meal in haste, unleavened bread, eating the roasted lamb, the blood of that lamb staining the doorposts as it sits there through the night, all of Egypt is losing their firstborn. Not a single family is not touched by death. Now it's time for the Exodus. It's time to leave Egypt. After the firstborn die, Pharaoh summons in Moses and Aaron, and he says, get out, just leave, just go, take everything. And God had already predicted that the Egyptians would be favorably disposed to the Israelites when they went to leave, and told them, ask the Egyptians that you live with, ask those that are around you for anything, and they'll give it to you. And so as they're packing up and getting ready to go, Israel starts asking the Egyptians for anything that was on their mind, for their jewelry, for their clothing, for everything that they have, for the different things that they have that they wanted. And the Egyptians say, here, take it, just go. Take it, just go. Take it, just go. And so they plundered the Egyptians. And so they go and they leave. And Israel, in a rush, leaves the bondage of Egypt. And then when they leave, it's exactly 430 years to the day after Jacob had moved there in the land of famine, whenever there was a famine going on. And Joseph was the second to Pharaoh. 430 years to the day. And they're marching out. The Bible says that in Exodus 12:41, if you want to check my numbers on that. That's longer than the United States has been a country. Israel was in bondage. It was in Egypt for 430 years. And then they left. When they left, they took Joseph's bones. Remember Joseph back, when we talked about his story, whenever he was dying, he made the sons of Israel promise that they would carry him out, because he promised them, he told them, a deliverer will come, you will leave. So 430 years later, it happened. And Moses made sure they took Joseph's bones. That's in Exodus 13, verse 19. And as they all go to leave, the way the count went, it was 600,000 men on foot, plus women and children, and all their livestock, and all the things they took from the Egyptians, all of that. Exodus 12:37 gives that number. And they're all leaving. And everything is great. Everyone's praising God. This finally happened. God showed up. Miracle after miracle. Boy, he beat down those Egyptians. He showed them good. And here we go. We're on our way out. We even got to get rich out of this. All this stuff's been restored. All the things that they have pulled off our back over all these years, now we've been compensated for and have back here. And now we're able to leave. And so as they're leaving, they go out into the wilderness, and the Lord leads them. The Lord leads them by a pillar of cloud by day, gives them some shade from the sun. A pillar of fire by night, The Bible says that's also not just so that they had the light there to see, but also it gave them light to travel by, so they could travel by day or night as the Lord is leading them. And everything was wonderful until Pharaoh got mad about it all, came to his senses, if you will, and he said, you know what, I'm going to chase them down, and I'm going to just mow them down. I'm done with them. And so he gets all of his chariots together, they get them all loaded up, and he goes chasing them down. And as the Israelites are following the cloud, Pharaoh's bearing down on them, and Pharaoh pins them against the Red Sea. Thinks, here's my chance, because now they're pinned in by the Red Sea on the back, and I can just take them out. There's nowhere left for them to go. And I'm going to actually read that part of the story for you, starting in chapter 14, Exodus 14, starting at verse 5, just so that I don't leave out any of the particulars of how this happens. Exodus 14, starting at verse 5. When the kingdom of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, what have we done? We've let the Israelites go and have lost their services. So he had his chariot made ready, and he took his army with him. He took 600 of the best chariots, along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites who were marching out boldly. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, horsemen and troops, pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they camped by the sea, near Pi-hahiroth, opposite of Baal-zephon. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us out to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. Everything was going wonderful until things got a lot of it hard. Moses answered the people, do not be afraid. Stand firm and you'll see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today you'll never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. But then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. We have a leadership issue going on here. We got all the Israelites going, oh, you should have just left us there. They suddenly forgot all this stuff that happened to bring them out into freedom. We should go back there. It would have been better just for us to stay in bondage than to be dead out here. Moses is saying, stand still, the Lord's going to fight with you. The Lord's saying, would you get a move on, please? I'm going to help you, but you need to keep these guys moving. The Lord continues his instructions to Moses. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they'll go in after them. And I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. Then the angel of God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the clouds brought darkness to one side and light to the other, so neither went near the other all night long. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. Can you imagine that? Can you just imagine that for a second? I'm going to stop and watch this. I love the ocean. I love being out on the boat in the ocean. I get a little bit freaked when my depth finder says 100, 300 feet, 400 feet. I'm going, there's a lot of water between me where I'm floating and what's on the bottom. But I love the ocean. I don't know if I quite want to walk through it, but that would be kind of an amazing thing. Couldn't you imagine that? Going through a wall of water on this side, we're talking 20, 40, 100 feet. Who knows? Maybe they're walking through the shallows. Maybe it was only a 20-foot wall. Maybe they were walking through the channel. Maybe it was a 400-foot wall. Who knows? But a wall of water on one side, a wall of water on the other side, dry ground in the middle, and it's nighttime. Go, guys. Come on, Israel. Down in there. Go on through. Wow. But there they go. Down into it, crossing on dry ground. Wall of water on one side, wall of water on the other side. It's a good thing I wasn't there. I'd probably want to troll through it, kind of flip a lure out into the wall and walk and drag it down through and see what I might catch on the way along. I don't know. Anywho, yeah. Hang with me here. I'm trying to hang with you. Hang with me as we go through this again. Wall of water on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued them then. So they've got Oops, fell here. They're going to go after him. So the Egyptians pursued them. All Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He made the wheels of their chariots come off so that they had difficulty driving. And the Egyptians said, "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen." Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and the horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the great power of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. That is how far God went to deliver his chosen people, Israel. That is how far he went. And this is the story. This story and Passover were central to the understanding of God and their worship. If you go through the Psalms, you will see the recounting of the plagues. You'll see the recounting of them crossing through the sea. You'll see it brought up over and over and over again in Israel's books of worship. And it is still central. Passover and remembering this story, remembering God saving Israel, is still central to those of the Jewish faith. They'll be celebrating Passover. They celebrate Passover right at the same time as we're celebrating Easter. How far will God go to deliver you? How far will God go to deliver you, one of his chosen children? He'll go even further. He will go even further. God works in the day-to-day life to bring you out of your bondage. Just the Holy Spirit will show you what your bondage is. You may not be a slave to somebody to build their kingdom, or you might be. But God will show you what it is. It might be an addiction. It might be a habit. It might be something inside of you that's just waiting to bust out. And because of all the hurts in your past life, it locks you in and you're afraid to step out and be who you really are. Who knows what it is? But God works in the day-to-day to bring you out of your bondage. You know what yours is. I know what mine is. And I know that God works day-to-day to help me step out of it and to pull me out of it and deliver me from it. He does the same for you. The question is, for all of us, have you ever complained that it would have been better to remain in your bondage situation than to have the struggles and challenges of being free? Whenever you finally got out there and you praised God for the exodus out of where you were, and you got out there and you said, yes, freedom's great, and then all of a sudden circumstances changed, things got a little bit hard, and you said, but it's just be better for me if I just would have stayed back there, stayed in that, than to be out. I know that I've said yes different times, or maybe I was in denial enough not to say yes. I felt yes, but I was saying no, 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 no. But the next step to being healed and coming out of bondage is to be that honest with God, to say, you know what, I got to confess to you, there have been times when I've said, you know, Egypt looked a whole lot better than the freedom you're leading me into. And then you become even more free when you're that real with God in the process. How far will God go to deliver you, one of his chosen children, even further? Because God has also worked out once and for all to deliver you and me from slavery to sin. Israel's deliverance at the Exodus cost the firstborn of Egypt. Your deliverance and my deliverance was bought with the death of God's own firstborn, his only born, his son, Jesus. And we'll be exploring that story next week. In today's story, we see God's power demonstrated to deliver his chosen people, Israel. The events, the plagues, the Passover, the Exodus, the Red Sea. They became part of Israel's faith story. They became part of their worship. It's what they would remember when times were tough. In next week's story, we're going to see God's power demonstrated to deliver his chosen people, not only Israel, but you and me and all of humanity. The events of Jesus' passion are now part of our faith story, our worship. It's what we remember when times are tough. The death of God's only begotten Son has made the way for the judgment of God, the destruction of God, to pass over us. Thanks be to God that he still delivers. Thanks be to God that he's gone even further for us. then he went to release the Egyptians back in the story of Exodus. Let us pray.